This morning, as a new day rises before us, we come with humble hearts and open hands, seeking strength that does not depend on circumstances and faith that does not collapse under pressure. We come longing for a faith like Job's, a faith that stands firm when answers are delayed, when comfort is stripped away, and when the night feels longer than the day. Lord, as we begin this morning prayer, teach us how to trust you not only when life is full, but also when life feels empty. Father God, we acknowledge that many mornings begin with gratitude and hope, but some mornings begin with questions and silent tears. Job's story reminds us that faith is not proven in abundance alone, but refined in adversity. He lost what was precious, he endured pain that words could not explain, yet his heart remained anchored in you. Today, we ask you to shape our faith in that same way, steady, sincere, and deeply rooted in who you are. Unshakable faith is not formed in moments of ease, but in seasons when everything familiar is shaken. It is the kind of faith that remains standing when comfort disappears and certainty fades. Job's life reflects a faith that was not rooted in blessings, but anchored in the character of God. When loss came suddenly and severely, his faith was tested at every level, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Yet even in the midst of unbearable suffering, his heart did not detach from God. This teaches that true faith is not measured by how loudly we praise when life is good, but by how firmly we stand when life falls apart. Suffering has a way of exposing the foundation of our faith. When health fails, relationships break, and plans collapse, what we truly believe rises to the surface. Job lost his possessions, his children, his health, and even the support of those closest to him. Despite this, he did not abandon his reverence for God. His pain was real, his grief was deep, yet his faith did not dissolve. This kind of faith does not deny suffering, it endures within it. It acknowledges pain without allowing pain to define the truth about God. Unshakable faith does not mean silence in sorrow. Job cried out, questioned, and wrestled with confusion, yet his wrestling never turned into rebellion. There is a difference between questioning God and quitting on God. Faith like Job's allows space for tears and honest emotions while remaining anchored in trust. It shows that faith is not about suppressing pain, but bringing pain into the presence of God. When suffering is carried alone, it becomes unbearable, but when suffering is placed before God, it becomes a place where faith is strengthened. In suffering, many people are tempted to believe that God has abandoned them. Job's experience challenges this belief. Even when God seemed silent, he was still present. Faith that is unshakable believes in God's presence even when it cannot be felt. It understands that silence is not absence, and delay is not denial. This type of faith refuses to be ruled by emotions or circumstances, and instead clings to the unchanging nature of God. Unshakable faith also resists bitterness. Pain often invites resentment, especially when suffering feels undeserved. Job was described as righteous, yet he endured immense loss. This reveals that suffering is not always the result of wrongdoing. Faith that endures suffering without turning bitter is faith that trusts God's justice beyond human understanding. It chooses humility over accusation and surrender over control. Instead of demanding explanations, it rests in the belief that God's wisdom exceeds human logic. Another strength of unshakable faith is endurance. Faith is not proven in a single moment but over time. Job's trial was not brief, it was prolonged. Day after day his suffering continued, and still his faith remained intact. Enduring faith does not rush God's process or abandon hope because of delay. It waits, even when waiting is painful, believing that God is still working. This endurance is not passive but deeply rooted in trust, allowing faith to grow stronger as the trial continues. Unshakable faith is also revealed through worship in weakness. Job's response to loss was not denial but reverence. Worship in suffering is one of the strongest expressions of faith because it declares God's worth regardless of circumstances. This kind of worship does not come from abundance, but from surrender. It is a decision to honor God even when life hurts. Such faith does not depend on what God gives, but on who God is. Faith, like Job's, is not immune to doubt, but it is resistant to defeat. Doubt may pass through the mind, but it does not settle in the heart. The heart remains committed to trusting God even when the mind struggles to understand. This shows that faith is not the absence of questions, but the presence of commitment. It holds on to God not because everything makes sense, but because God remains faithful. Suffering refines faith by removing what is shallow and revealing what is genuine. Job's faith was purified through loss, stripped of dependency on possessions, status, and comfort. What remained was a faith centered entirely on God. This refinement process is painful, but it produces a faith that cannot be easily shaken. It becomes resilient, grounded, and deeply rooted in eternal truth. Unshakable faith does not rely on outcomes. It does not worship God for restoration, but trusts Him before restoration comes. Job's faith existed before his blessings were returned. This reveals that true faith is not conditional. It does not say, "I will trust if," but declares, "I will trust even when." Such faith honors God not for what He does, but for who He is, standing firm regardless of circumstances. Trusting God without understanding requires a surrender that goes beyond logic and explanation. It is a decision to believe in God's goodness even when life presents contradictions. Job's journey reflects a faith that did not depend on clarity. He lived through confusion, unanswered questions, and overwhelming loss, yet he continued to place his trust in God. This kind of trust does not come naturally. It is learned through surrender and cultivated through humility. It is the faith that remains when reasons are unavailable and certainty is stripped away. Human nature seeks explanations, especially in suffering. When pain enters life, the immediate response is to ask why. Job asked questions, but he did not allow his questions to sever his trust. Trusting God without understanding does not mean ignoring the desire for answers. It means refusing to let the absence of answers destroy faith. Job teaches that understanding is not a requirement for trust. God does not always reveal the reasons behind suffering, but He always remains worthy of trust. Trust without understanding acknowledges the limits of human perspective. Job eventually realized that God's wisdom operated far beyond his ability to comprehend. This realization did not come through explanations, but through encounter. When God spoke, He did not answer every question Job asked, yet Job's trust deepened. This shows that trust is strengthened not by information, but by intimacy. Knowing God's character becomes more important than knowing God's plans. Letting go of understanding requires releasing control. Control often disguises itself as wisdom, but in reality it reflects fear. Job's experience reveals that faith grows when control is surrendered. When everything familiar was taken away, Job could no longer rely on stability, security, or predictability. All that remained was God. Trust in this context is not passive acceptance, but active reliance on God's sovereignty. It is the choice to rest in God's authority even when life feels chaotic. Trusting God without understanding also challenges pride. Pride demands explanations, fairness, and immediate resolution. Faith demands humility. Job's humility grew as he recognized that God owed him nothing and that his life existed within God's greater purpose. This humility did not weaken Job. It strengthened his faith. It allowed him to submit to God's will without resentment. True trust bows before God's wisdom, acknowledging that God sees what humans cannot see. This type of trust transforms how suffering is endured. Instead of resisting pain, faith learns to walk through it with God. Job did not escape suffering, but he did not walk through it alone. Trust without understanding creates space for God's presence in the darkest moments. It allows the heart to remain open instead of closing in self-protection. This openness keeps faith alive even when circumstances remain unchanged. Trust without understanding also guards the heart against despair. When answers are unavailable, despair often fills the gap. Faith fills that gap instead. Job's trust prevented his suffering from becoming meaningless. Even without explanations, his trust gave purpose to endurance. It kept hope alive in the absence of evidence. This kind of trust does not depend on visible progress, but on invisible assurance. Believing without understanding requires patience. Job waited through seasons of silence, pain, and uncertainty. Waiting without answers is one of the most difficult expressions of faith. It tests the depth of trust and the sincerity of surrender. Yet patience in waiting refines faith, teaching dependence rather than urgency. Trust grows as the heart learns to rest instead of striving for immediate resolution. Trusting God without understanding reshapes prayer. Prayer becomes less about demanding explanations and more about seeking God's presence. Job's prayers evolved from questioning to surrender. This transformation reveals that prayer is not always about changing circumstances, but about changing the heart. When understanding is absent, prayer becomes an anchor that holds faith steady. This trust also deepens spiritual maturity. Faith that relies on understanding remains fragile, but faith that rests in God becomes resilient. Job's journey shows that maturity is not the absence of struggle, but the willingness to trust through struggle. Trust without understanding does not eliminate pain, but it prevents pain from destroying faith. Trusting God without understanding is ultimately a declaration of confidence in God's character. It believes that God is just, faithful, and sovereign even when life seems unjust and unfair. This confidence allows faith to survive confusion, endure loss, and remain steady in uncertainty. It teaches the heart to trust God's heart. When the mind cannot grasp God's ways, perseverance through silence and waiting is one of the most demanding expressions of faith because it requires strength without reassurance and hope without visible progress. Job's story reveals that some of the deepest spiritual battles are fought not in moments of crisis alone, but in the long stretches of quiet where God seems distant and answers do not come. Waiting in silence tests faith at its core, stripping away emotional comfort and replacing it with a choice to remain faithful without confirmation. Silence often feels heavier than suffering itself. Pain can be endured when there is communication, but silence leaves the heart wrestling with uncertainty. Job experienced seasons where God did not respond immediately, and the absence of divine explanation intensified his struggle. Yet perseverance means continuing to trust even when prayers are met with quiet. It is the decision to believe that God is still listening, even when there is no immediate response. Waiting challenges the human desire for urgency. Faith naturally wants movement, change, and resolution, but perseverance accepts that growth often happens slowly. Job waited through prolonged suffering without knowing when relief would come. This kind of waiting teaches dependence rather than control. It reshapes faith from a demand for quick answers into a steady commitment to remain present with God through uncertainty. Perseverance in silence also reveals the difference between faith rooted in emotion and faith rooted in conviction. Emotions fluctuate with circumstances, but conviction remains grounded in truth. Job's emotions shifted between sorrow, confusion, and anguish, yet his commitment to God did not collapse. This demonstrates that perseverance is not the absence of emotional struggle, but the refusal to abandon faith because of emotional pain. Silence has the power to expose hidden expectations. Many expect God to respond on a specific timeline or in a particular way. When silence disrupts those expectations, faith is either weakened or refined. Job's perseverance required releasing expectations of immediate clarity. This release did not diminish his faith, it purified it. Faith that endures silence learns to trust God's timing rather than insisting on its own. Waiting also deepens self-awareness. In the absence of answers, the heart is forced to confront its motives, fears, and insecurities. Job's waiting revealed his deep longing for justice and understanding, but it also revealed his growing humility. Perseverance allows faith to mature by aligning the heart with God's will rather than personal desire. This alignment strengthens trust and produces spiritual depth. Perseverance through silence requires discipline. It is a daily choice to remain faithful even when nothing changes. Job's endurance was not sustained by constant encouragement, but by an unwavering decision to remain connected to God. Discipline in faith involves continuing to pray, worship, and trust even when these actions feel unproductive. This consistency builds spiritual resilience. Waiting often feels unproductive, yet it is one of the most productive seasons of faith. While external circumstances remain unchanged, internal transformation occurs. Job's waiting reshaped his understanding of God and himself. It refined his faith, deepened his humility, and strengthened his dependence on God. Perseverance allows faith to grow quietly, much like roots developing underground before visible growth appears. Silence also teaches faith to listen rather than speak. In moments of waiting, the heart learns to be still. Job's encounter with God came after a long period of silence. This suggests that silence is not a sign of abandonment but preparation. Perseverance positions the heart to receive revelation at the right time. Waiting becomes an act of trust rather than frustration. Perseverance guards faith against impulsive decisions. In silence, there is temptation to act prematurely or abandon trust. Job resisted the urge to turn away from God despite intense pressure. This restraint protected his faith from irreversible choices made in moments of despair. Perseverance teaches patience, helping faith remain steady instead of reactive. Waiting in faith also builds endurance for future challenges. Perseverance through one season of silence strengthens the ability to endure the next. Job's endurance became a testimony of faith that outlasted suffering. This endurance did not remove pain, but ensured that pain did not have the final word. Perseverance through silence and waiting ultimately shapes a faith that is independent of immediate outcomes. It learns to trust God's presence rather than demand His explanation. This kind of faith remains anchored in hope even when the horizon appears unchanged, holding on to trust as an intentional choice rather than an emotional response. Restoration after endurance reveals the redemptive nature of faith that remains steadfast through suffering. Job's journey demonstrates that endurance is not meaningless waiting, but a process that prepares the heart for renewal. Restoration is not simply the return of what was lost. It is the transformation of what remains. Endurance shapes faith in ways comfort never can, refining trust, deepening humility, and strengthening reliance on God. When restoration comes, it meets a heart that has been reshaped by perseverance. Endurance changes perspective. Before suffering, blessings are often taken for granted, but after enduring loss, restoration carries new weight and meaning. Job's restoration was not merely about material return, but about spiritual renewal. His understanding of God expanded beyond surface-level faith into a deeper, more intimate relationship. Endurance taught him that restoration begins internally before it is ever visible externally. Restoration after endurance also reflects God's timing. It does not arrive according to human schedules but unfolds in divine order. Job endured seasons of pain without knowing when relief would come. This waiting prepared him to receive restoration without pride. Faith that endures learns patience, and patience prepares the heart to steward blessings wisely. Restoration given too early may be wasted, but restoration after endurance is appreciated and honored. Endurance produces maturity that sustains restoration. Without maturity, restoration can become another source of dependency rather than gratitude. Job's endurance stripped away entitlement and replaced it with reverence. When restoration arrived, it rested on a foundation of humility rather than expectation. This maturity ensured that blessings would not replace God as the center of faith. Restoration also reveals God's justice and compassion. Job's suffering was not ignored, and his faithfulness was not forgotten. Restoration affirmed that endurance is seen, valued, and remembered by God. This assurance strengthens faith during future trials, reinforcing the belief that suffering does not have the final word. Restoration becomes evidence that God's purposes extend beyond the pain. Endurance prepares the heart to receive restoration without resentment. Many endure hardship with bitterness, but faith transforms endurance into surrender. Job's restoration was possible because his heart remained open rather than hardened. Endurance without bitterness allows restoration to heal rather than reopen wounds. It replaces resentment with peace and regret with gratitude. Restoration after endurance also carries responsibility. Blessings restored are not meant to erase the past, but to redeem it. Job's renewed life became a testimony of faith that endured. Restoration turns personal suffering into shared hope. It allows faith to speak with credibility, offering comfort to others walking through similar trials. Endurance reshapes identity, and restoration confirms it. Job's identity was no longer tied to possessions or status, but to his relationship with God. Restoration did not redefine him, it affirmed who he had become through suffering. Faith that endures loss and receives restoration learns that identity is anchored in God, not circumstances. Restoration does not imply that suffering was good, but it reveals that suffering was not wasted. Endurance transforms pain into purpose. Job's restoration demonstrated that God redeems what suffering threatens to destroy. Faith learns that even the darkest seasons contribute to a greater narrative of redemption. Restoration also renews hope for the future. Endurance teaches that trials are temporary, but faith is enduring. When restoration arrives, it strengthens confidence in God's faithfulness. This confidence becomes a source of courage for future challenges. Faith that has experienced restoration after endurance trusts God more deeply because it has witnessed redemption firsthand. Endurance refines desire, and restoration satisfies it in unexpected ways. Job's deepest longing was not simply relief from pain, but understanding and closeness with God. Restoration fulfilled this longing by deepening his awareness of God's presence. Blessings regained were secondary to the restored relationship with God. Restoration after endurance is not a return to the past, but an entrance into something new. Job's life after suffering was not identical to life before suffering. Endurance changed him, and restoration met him in that change. Faith that endures does not seek to go backward, but moves forward with renewed strength, deeper trust, and clearer purpose. This morning, we choose faith like Job, faith that stands when everything shakes, faith that worships even when wounded, faith that believes even when broken. We place our lives, our families, our struggles, and our future into your hands. You are faithful, you are just, and you are worthy of our trust. We begin this day with surrender, with hope, and with unwavering faith. In every moment, in every trial, and in every blessing, we declare that you are our God, and we will trust you. Amen.